I owe you, the listener, the viewer, my honesty. I'm tired. Not just tired, I'm exhausted. I know what burnout feels like, and I can see it on the horizon if I keep doing things the way that I am right now. If you've been subscribed to On Offense since the beginning, you know I've been trying to keep pace with a weekly release schedule, and you also know I've missed more than a few of those weeks this year. As a new dad, someone running a couple of nonprofits, a couple of companies, trying to keep up with short-form content production, writing, planning concerts and fundraisers, attending conferences, and everything else that comes with this work, it's been a lot. So here's the bad news. I'm not going to be publishing weekly episodes for a while. Moving forward, I plan to release episodes every 2 weeks. Now, this is a little inside baseball, but I want you to understand the stakes. The algorithms are going to punish me for producing fewer episodes and fewer clips. Podcasts that don't maintain a high publishing velocity generally don't get rewarded with new audiences. The show is almost certainly going to grow much more slowly as a result. But it's a trade-off that I have to make. Now, for the good news, I'm not stepping back because I'm burnt out. I'm doing it because I have a few really big projects on my plate that are important to me, and I think they're going to be important to you. First, with Valor Media Network, I'm producing a slate of new podcasts by some of my favorite anti-fascist veterans. You can check out the first of those new shows right now, Danger Close with Matt Gordon. Yes, that Matt Gordon, USMC Angry Veteran, who joined me back in episode 13. The next show we'll be releasing just a few weeks from now is called Hellcats. Stay tuned for more on that soon. Second, less than 3 months from now, I'll be releasing my first book. I wrote the foreword to a new collection of writings by General Smedley Butler, the namesake of my Nazi hunting nonprofit, who you learned about back in episode 5 when Jonathan Katz joined me on the show. And third, this show itself is going from your podcast app and your YouTube feed to paperback. Over the summer, I'll be writing a book based on the ethos of On Offense. The premise is simple. We cannot stay in a defensive posture if we expect democracy to survive this period of authoritarianism. We have to go on offense. We have to become active participants in shaping what comes next. I'll be taking the lessons I've learned from years of organizing, investigating extremist movements, and interviewing some of the smartest historians, journalists, and activists that I've ever met, and turning them into a practical handbook for people who want to do more than watch events unfold. And I want to be clear about my language here. We're not fighting to go back to some other time. We're not trying to make America great again or build back better. This is forward-facing. This is us looking at the country as it exists today, as it has for the last 250 years, and saying, that's not good enough. What we will not be doing is what we've heard from talking heads for the last decade. We will not be telling you it's going to be okay. We will not be telling people to hold on a little longer. We will not be telling ourselves that the heroes are coming to save the day. Waiting is not a strategy. This will be a call to action. And that brings me to today's guest, because as I've started outlining this book, I've found myself wrestling with a question that sits at the center of everything we talk about on this show. Why do so many people recognize the danger we're facing, yet still believe that someone else is going to solve it? If you've spent any time watching cable news or the clips that inevitably make their way onto social media, you've probably heard some version of the same message ad nauseum. The founders built a system for this. The Supreme Court won't let him do that. This is too far even for the Republicans in Congress. Even MAGA voters won't allow for this to happen. Democracy will survive. The Constitution gives us tools. All that's a reassuring story. It's also one that a lot of Americans desperately want to believe. But what if that story is part of the problem? My guest today is historian, Army veteran, and returning On Offense guest, Tad Stoermer, author of A Resistance History of the United States. In his new book, Tad argues that Americans have been taught a version of history that encourages us to place our faith in mythical leaders, immortal founding documents, and weak institutions, instead of understanding how ordinary people have actually resisted abuses of power throughout our history to protect and expand our freedoms. And he's especially critical of the pacifiers, the voices telling Americans to wait, trust the system, and believe that somehow everything will work itself out on its own. In this conversation, we talk about why so many Americans feel exhausted after a decade of political crisis, why opposition movements struggle to convert outrage into power, what we've misunderstood about figures like George Washington and Martin Luther King Jr., and what lessons resistance movements from the anti-federalists to the abolitionists can teach us about organizing today. I'm Chris Goldsmith, and this is On Offense. Here's my conversation with Tad Stoermer. Tad Stoermer, first guest, back again, historian, Army veteran, just published your book, Resistance History of the United States, this week. Congratulations. Last time that we spoke and that my audience got to hear from you, you had literally just put down the pen. You had just finished writing. Now your baby is out in the world. What is it that you are hoping to tell people with this book? What are you looking to do this summer to help people understand about the American history of resistance and how it applies to what we're living through today?
Well, I'm not looking to tell people anything. I'm looking to get people to start having a conversation. I want people to start asking questions about where we came from, how we got here, and why our political world right now looks the way it does, and why there are frustrations with how it is not being resolved, why there doesn't seem to be a path forward that will result in kind of an immediate change, is working the way it is. And to then talk about, okay, well, since that's the case, what really is the next step? The fact that there is a history behind this that we can talk about, and that's kind of where I think the book sits. Here's our history behind what resistance has meant in the United States, but also what has kept American resistance from taking the next step, from operating at scale, from making structural change, which means we have to keep fighting these fights. So it's really about, it's almost an exercise in pattern recognition over the next couple of months, so that people can see how we got to where they are, how they sit in that dynamic, and therefore what they can then do about it.
So last episode we kicked off talking about your favorite historian, Ken Burns. As I was reading your book, I was thinking about John Meacham, who you write about as kind of a pacifier, as someone who's stood by us and kind of as a historian basically told us it'll all work itself out because this is what the founders intended and they gave us the tools. I used to be a pretty frequent guest on MSNBC. That hasn't been the case the last couple of years, but I'm thinking about all of those times where I've listened to Meacham do just that. Before January 6th, after January 6th, basically pacifying us and not demanding any reforms. How is it that a constitutional amendment, which you write about in your conclusion and epilogue, how is it that a constitutional amendment can fix some of the things that we have seen, like the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, the Dobbs decision ending the right to an abortion? How is it that constitutional amendments fix what John Meacham says is not broken?
It doesn't. A constitutional amendment, that kind of structural change, that can fix how power works and how it how it impacts people and what people can do through the permitted channels. It changes the permitted channels. It enables people to identify their rights, protect their rights, and not have to go outside of them to force change. But what that doesn't do is break down the pacifying effect, right? The pacifying effect doesn't come from the Constitution. It comes from the political culture. And it comes from these chilling effects that are particular political culture. And this is one reason why resistance efforts in other places aren't an easy fit. You can't teleport something that happened in Hungary into the United States. We literally play by different rules. And so what Meacham does, and again, a pacifier is the absolute best way to put it, because and it's also shockingly dangerous, because it fits in with these narratives we have built up in American political culture that says exactly that. You don't need to change. You can just wait. Everything will be okay, because it always has been for people who look, walk, and talk just like John Meacham. Of course he will say they're fine. They will be fine for people like him. For everybody else, you can wait, you can hope. The system will adapt over time because it is fundamentally good. It is fundamentally sound. All of the systems that the founders set up to address your grievances, you can be happy with the way those will be managed, even if you fail, because it's the best system on the planet. That's structural without being governmental, right? That's structural in our culture to say that you can wait, have faith in the founders that it will work out. That is shockingly conservative and shockingly dangerous. So a constitutional amendment can address the political, the legal, even the judicial structures that of the way power is managed and the way that you can address changes to it. But what you can't do with that is address the huge narrative problem that we have, which is all of these people, and John Meacham sort of is an acolyte of this, telling you that everything will be fine because the founders got it right in all respects the first time. And everybody since has kind of been in service to their vision, when the reality is an inversion of that. And that's what people need to recognize. And that's the conversation when we talk about MSNBC and your work, is that's the conversation nobody wants to have. That is the most difficult conversation that I have with anybody, because nobody really wants to have that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Last time that we talked, the No Kings protests had kind of become a big thing. On the left, people were very excited, seeing millions and millions of people. Every time that there was a No Kings protest, it got bigger and bigger. Have you seen any fundamental changes in this large protest movement since it began, since you finished your book, or is it still the same? Do you still have the same criticisms of No Kings being a big day where we have a burst of energy, no clear demands, no clear action after, and things fizzle out?
Well, I think that the biggest change is that I think their merchandising has gotten better. I mean, they've definitely improved that. They've improved their messaging and their merchandising. The function of them hasn't changed remotely. It wasn't doing anything in the first place. It was organizing for, I suppose, for the Democratic Party and kind of allied organizations, but as a function of protest. It wasn't functional then. It's not functional now. But what it does, relating to what our conversation about Meacham, it provides this chilling effect and we talked about this last time, that it provides you a pacifier for believing that you were engaging in protest, in opposition. It releases the pressure, it releases the steam, and then you can go back to your daily life. And this is one of the conversations that it's useful to have this summer with the book. And it's one of the things that I hope people get out of the book is understanding resistance as a process. It's not sort of one thing. You have to understand how resistance works and how it has worked in our history to see, well, what role does protest play, and therefore what function does something like No Kings have to do for it to be any part of protest at all, any part of a process that will get you to the point where you are pushing back against abusive authority, rather than enabling it, reinforcing it by just providing an outlet for the energy of people who want to oppose and think that they are doing it, but it gets misdirected, it gets co-opted by groups like No King. I think it's shocking.
This summer is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. We've got things like the Heritage Foundation funding buses going around and telling their version of history, what you call the patriot myth. Why is it important for people to understand the duality of, if you would even call it a duality of a figure like George Washington, who spent much of his life chasing down a slave that had freed herself from his grasp and hid for over 50 years? How is it that we as Americans can better understand what we're all capable of if we understand the lack of perfection among figures like Washington?
I think it's by ignoring figures like Washington. I think that the fundamental question we had to have, and we're not having this year, whether it's about Washington or whether it's about the Declaration of Independence, is whether it matters. And this is my point, is that by focusing on that document or by focusing on Washington, we're really centering the war, right? We're centering what happens in independence with independence in 1776. A big deal, achieve some things. The achievement of independence, the fact of it, different from the Declaration, right? What happens on July 2nd, 1776 is somewhat different than what happens on July 4th. And for centering Washington, not really part of the Patriot Resistance Movement. He is really a symbol of the war and what comes out of the war. Those are different things when it comes to the American Revolution and the kind of things that you're talking about. If we want to understand what the Patriot Resistance Movement was for individual rights and what that meant in pushing back against the abusive authority of the British government, what that took, what that looked like, what that meant, then that's a separate conversation about separate people. And so, and which gets into these questions about who we think Americans are, who gets left out, what are the ideas that are in fact activating whatever the people think that we are. That is a separate conversation about ideas that gets not just hijacked, but it gets pushed out of the way by an insistence on focusing on leaders who are really a product of the war. And people have flattened our understanding of what the American founding was by flattening the Patriot Resistance before the war and the war itself, and then the whole framing of the Constitution into one glorious event that naturally follows one thing upon the other. When, even as Adams pointed out, these things have very little to do with one another. They're related, but they're not necessarily. They don't necessarily follow, and so you need to understand these kind of questions about who we are, who we can be, by actually focusing on the revolution, of which the war is not even the most important part. And so when we focus on Washington, that is in itself a misdirection, because then we're saying, okay, well, there is this focal point of authority that rests in Washington inherently, and we can see America through him, rather than seeing him somewhat peripheral to what the American Revolution was, part of the achievement of kind of the war and the nation state that emerges from the war. Even in that, you're following it down a different channel, so that you can get a conversation about how he is out of step with what we think that war should have been about, particularly with how he and the best example is how he deals with Oni Judge, how he weaponizes and abuses his office in the federal government to go after Ona, which I think is one of the important points of that chapter. To go ahead and abuse that authority on his own. Why? Because that's in fact who he is. That's who that part of the founders were. It's not anything that in fact needs to be explained to them. I don't think it's terribly complicated by these people who exploited other people throughout their lives, were just continue to do so. It's part of their worldview. But our confusion is aligning Washington with what we think America is and can be. And so when you have the Heritage Foundation going around insisting that America is those people, that's where we start losing the fight. Because we have to get on those terms, we have to get on that turf, we have to start debating Washington. If you want to talk about the American nation state and how the presidency evolves, even kind of his role in the Constitution, which isn't great. If you want to talk about those questions of authority, that's separate, I think, to the bigger questions that Americans say they want to have about, well, what does the 250th mean? What is America at this point? What did it take to get to independence? What were the grievances? What were the goals? We can't have that conversation if you're immediately talking about Washington, who never thought about that stuff in his life before he got to the presidency. Even after that, he thought about those in his own terms. So I think that where we are hamstrung in this, Chris, is that the terms of the debate have already been set into a conversation that keeps us from discussing the actual ideas that informed the American Revolution. We can't even get to it.
I don't remember the exact phrasing that you used, but you described how the Underground Railroad has been taught to us as kind of like a charity function, rather than a highly sophisticated underground criminal ring, which it was at the time. Is it possible for us to help? Can we reform like the way that kids are taught this stuff, or are these ideas too complex for a child? Like you learn about the Underground Railroad, I would guess, if in like 4th or 5th grade. Can a 4th or 5th grader understand these complexities, or do we need to wait until adulthood to explain these concepts? Because I think that part of the patriot myth that you're talking about is it's indoctrinated in us in childhood. But I wonder if we're mature enough at that age, and I feel like we're not, to understand those complexities. Like, can we teach kids about the righteousness of an underground criminal ring?
I think so. It's a good question. I think so. Because all resistance networks, all the things that you resist for, they're all personal and they're all local at the start. And I think if there is anything that 4th and 5th graders can understand, is what you do on the playground, what you do with your friends in a classroom, what you do with your friends at lunch, the kind of things that you share, the kind of things that you kind of can band together about. And to me, that fundamental functional building block is what something that resistance networks like the Underground Railroad that are sophisticated in terms of their scale and their scope, but not sophisticated in terms of the basis of what it is they're doing. They are people organized locally who have the same values, who want to go, who don't care. But I think in 4th and 5th graders, they can sort of understand this in terms of not really caring. How do you get around what your teacher is doing if you don't agree with it? I think kids at that age can understand that, and understanding how what you're doing is infusing that with broader values. Do you want to do that for all the kids in your school? Do you want to do that for all kids, 4th graders, everywhere? This is the campaign of every student body president, isn't it? That they're going to sort of organize people sort of against the abusive authority of their school administration. At least it was when I was in school. And so I think so, because I think that we don't have to overcomplicate the values of resistance and the values of values of opposing abusive authority by complicating what at heart motivates that. Because at the end, at the beginning, it has to be personal, it has to be local, it has to be about the people you trust that are standing right next to you, and what you can do together that's going to achieve your goal against whatever the abusive authority you see in front of you. And so it's a good question, but I think it's okay, because I think that, again, where does the sophistication lie? That it's not in the basic building blocks. The basic building blocks of resistance are fairly straightforward. They're not always simple, but I think they're fairly straightforward. But the sophistication and the difficulty comes with how do you overcome the challenges that are put in your way by that abusive authority. And those are the choke points that I talk about in the book. That's when you have to become sophisticated. That's when you have to, like with the Underground Railroad, that's when you have to go underground. You can't be seen, because the abusive authority has a way of finding out where you are. If you've been criminalized, they can surveil you and go after you. And so that's where it becomes sophisticated. It becomes sophisticated in the means and the mechanism, but not in the basic building blocks. And so I think that when you're talking to kids who are in the 4th and 5th grade, I think they can understand those building blocks, because I think that it comes down to the basic elements of human nature itself. And I think that they're old enough at that age to understand that.
Mm-hmm. Assuming our listeners are not in charge of No Kings, and that they're relatively average people who may or may not be showing up, how can everyday people who are listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube, how can they start to influence a movement as large as No Kings that does have these events, and turn it more into something like the Underground Railroad, where it is a sophisticated network, where there are knowledge that is divided among folks, so that the entire thing doesn't collapse if one person is wrapped up by the authorities. How do everyday people co-opt a largely non-influential but very large movement like No Kings?
I think it's fairly easy. It's by not accepting their terms. They want to define it between, you want to set the terms that it's going to be between 2 and 4 on a Saturday afternoon, and what signs to bring and what signs not to bring, and what you can say and what you can't say, and when you must sing and when you must stop singing, and what you can sing about, is to not necessarily reject that, but not buy into that. Mm-hmm. For it to work, for it to perform a protest function, you can in fact perform that function at a place like that. You need to make sure that you are identifying what it is that you want to achieve, and you are identifying other people who are achieving those goals. That's what protest does. Protest enables you to articulate grievance, and not just articulate grievance so that the abusive authority hears it, but so that other people hear it too. So that people who are like-minded, who can be allies, can in fact identify you, and that you can connect with each other. That is the basic function of coming together at things, at protests like rallies like No Kings, to give them a protest function, to make sure that the grievance is being articulated clearly, and that other people can hear it, so you can start joining together. Because it's at that point, once people start joining together, this is about the dynamics of resistance, right? Once people start joining together, then you can organize opposition. Then you can gather resources, you can leverage them, you can strategize, you can target what it is that you're doing. But you can't get there if you're isolated. And so protests have this wonderful function, this wonderful movement building function of enabling people to identify each other. But the big chilling effect of No Kings is that they don't enable the articulation of grievance. They have very particular grievances and ways that you can articulate it that they are already packaging for you, which means they've already packaged the outcome. They've already packaged who you can align with. That is the big problem. But you cannot buy into that. You don't have to abide by that. Because these things are happening all over the place. And what is great about them is that it shows the incredible energy in the American people for opposition right now. And it's an opposition and an energy that can't be wasted, that shouldn't be wasted. And so that is the value, I think, of these rallies, is that if there are people who are willing to essentially ignore the No Kings organizers, ignore their terms, and do that work on the ground to in fact go through and identify people who are like-minded in their grievances. And I think that we can be very clear about what those grievances are with this administration, with this abusive authority, is to reject the terms of the No Kings protesters and operate on their own terms. Because the big problem that we're having from a historical perspective right now, what is mainly absent isn't the energy of folks on the ground. We see it at Delaney Hall, we see it in Minneapolis, we hear it online, but we have seen it on the ground. The missing historical point is coordination among opposition, among that opposition on the ground. And without that coordination, you can't leverage your resources in order to get them to operate at scale against an abusive authority that is already operating at scale. If they're operating, MAGA's operating nationally, they're already operating at scale. They have the federal government and all of its tools that they're deploying. You can't operate against that at scale to target its weak points, to put pressure points where they can be really exploited. You can't do that if you're playing whack-a-mole. And that's what opposition is doing in America right now. It's playing whack-a-mole, and that's wasting the energy. It's not that the energy isn't there. It's not that the desire is not there. It's not that the particular articulated grievances aren't there. It's just that they're not allowed, and by people like who are organizing No Kings, they're not allowed to be really given visibility so that other people can see each other on the ground and then connect from one town to another town to another town and connect those dots to figure out how to operate. That to me is the biggest missing link. As a historian looking at that, that's the biggest missing link.
Right now at Delaney Hall, there are folks that I've worked with, that I've interviewed for the show. Ian Austin, Army Ranger, 6 deployments. I met him in Minneapolis. He's now in New Jersey at Delaney Hall, and he's been, I think, quite effective in communicating abuse of authority, showing the physical bruises on his body. There are videos of him getting shot with pepper balls when it's very clear that he is not a threat to anyone. I saw a video where he was speaking on a bullhorn away from a crowd, not directly in the faces of, I don't even think they're law enforcement. I think they're just private contractors, and they shot the bullhorn, which was at face level, which violates all sorts of safety standards for the use of so-called less than lethal weaponry. Is what's happening at Delaney Hall having the effect that it should? From your overseas right now, is your interpretation of what is happening is filtered through social media and in news perhaps a bit different because of the algorithms and your location? From your observation, is what's happening at Delaney Hall being effective? If so, or if there are improvements that need to be made, how can activists around the country take lessons learned and implement them locally?
Yeah, there are two parts to that, because I've tried to do my best to kind of keep up with what's going on in Delaney Hall with VPN and being able to go ahead and watch it from the American perspective. The biggest problem that to me, and this is something that has been I think kind of new to me, is how the mainstream media has been absolutely absent in reporting what's going on. They've been occasionally checking in, but the kind of images that are coming from him and that are coming from other people about what's going on at Delaney Hall used to be 24/7. You wouldn't be able to get away from it. This is an extraordinary moment. It's an extraordinary opposition that's going on there. It's the clear visibility of an abusive authority acting abusively and the enabling of the Democratic governor. Right. And just her statements shown against the reality of going on the ground, the video of what's going on the ground. That in the recent past, even as recently as Minneapolis, would have been shown extensively across the mainstream media. So the failure right now is that it's not. And so the kind of visibility of doing what it did, he's doing the right resistance thing, right? What you need to do is show the violence in the system, right? You need to show what they are doing, what they were capable of. That is the direct action that we talk about when we talk about resistance operating, reaching its extreme end, because you have to in fact put your body in between the abusive authority and the abused, and you have to enable the authority to go ahead and reveal themselves and who they really are, and in terms of the lengths they're willing to go to protect their power, to protect their authority. He is doing that. What in the past, what made it that effective is that you could get earned media to promote that, right, to boost that signal. You're not getting the boost anymore. For whatever editorial reason on the part of mainstream media, you're not getting the boost anymore. So all of the visibility coming out of Delaney Hall has been directly through social media, and that right now that has limits until there is in order to reach new audiences, right? Because of the algorithms, it's going to reinforce existing audiences, and sort of it might serve a function of being able to mobilize people to go to Delaney Hall, to reach out to organizers on the ground and try to build it from there, just like in a similar way that it did to Minneapolis. But right now, because mainstream media is no longer boosting what is going on the ground accurately and authentically, it forces opposition leaders and opposition actors to try to find ways that they can get that signal out. In a sense, as a resistance tool, we talk about building parallel institutions, right? That once the institutions that you believe are supposed to serve to go ahead and achieve the goals you wanted to achieve, that you want information, you think that you're going to be politically represented, you think the judiciary is going to go ahead and represent the rule of law. Once they start failing, this has been a factor for resistance networks throughout American history. Once they start failing and they start enabling abuse of authority, then you got to build something that goes around them. And I think what we're seeing now is mainstream media falling down. And no longer performing its function for democracy. So you have to find another network in order to be able to another way to go ahead and get that stuff out there. Fortunately, social media gives you the tools. It's just about coming up with the right way to make sure that you're busting the algorithm. So it's getting it, which is, don't ask me how to do that, but it's, if you're able to figure that out, to be able to bust through the algorithm so that people who aren't already like-minded are seeing it. I mean, and that was the value of broadcast media. I mean, literally broadcast media, that everybody was able to see it. Now, with everything being algorithm driven, you can be kennelled. And so it doesn't matter what's going on the ground at Delaney Hall, because only people who already agree with the protesters or already agree with the abuse of authority, with already on the side of ICE, they're the only people who are going to see it, and they're going to see it in their echo chambers. The challenge right now from a communication standpoint is not just finding the signal in the noise, but it's letting the signal get out of theater, right? You've got to have other people be able to hear this stuff. That is the biggest challenge for that. So it's not that the right things aren't going on the ground there. They absolutely positively are. It's just that how do you take that now and get it out to broader audiences? That's the practical hurdle that needs to be overcome right now.
The World Cup right now is going to own the summer. It's probably going to get more earned media than anything except whatever crazy shit Donald Trump is doing on whatever day. Do you see, again, as someone who's currently outside the United States, do you see the World Cup drawing a different kind of spotlight on the United States and on these protests, on what ICE is doing? What is the perspective of people where you are right now, and the game that 5 billion people will be typically tuning into? Is it going to? What's the reflection of this resistance protest movement? What's the interpretation of those overseas?
Well, I think there are two parts to that. The first one is that it is the unexploited resource for American opposition are the number of allies they have in countries around the world, particularly in Europe. That the level of sympathy, that of real deep sympathy, an active kind of sympathy, that people in Europe have for anybody in opposition in America, and real opposition in America, is deep, and it's authentic, and it's real. And every story about the World Cup that pops up over here is accompanied by a kind of political angle to it. That it is clearly, none of it is being, unless you're focusing solely on the sports pages, the coverage that's every place else, and it's every place else. It's all contextual, relating how absurd what's going on with Trump in America is, in all of them. And so it is reinforcing this idea that that Europeans have about the American situation, and developing, again, this very strong sympathy and even empathy for opposing it. But the other part is that there's also bewilderment that there isn't an active opposition. And that's the question that I get all the time, and that keeps popping up even in the coverage of the World Cup, is they hope that they expect that there's going to be protests. But there's not a whole lot of confidence that there's going to be protests, and they're wondering why not. That this could be a fantastic. If it was happening in Europe, there would be disruptions all over the place. But you see what happened to Eurovision, for crying out loud. But the fact that there is no even inkling of any kind of disruption to this made-for moment of throwing a kind of distraction into the system, that makes a lot of the people I talk to and hear from, and even just in the mainstream media over here, I'm kind of bewildered. So it's two parts: that there is a real untapped resource for American opposition to use in having allies and resources in Europe and other places who are built in, ready to help. But the fact that there's no network there, there's no clear leader there, is something that they find to be bewildering.
Do you think that, I mean, I should just ask you more directly. Are people wondering why there's not a leader from, like, the Democratic Party? I think most people probably understand our two-party system. Are people wondering why there's not a Democrat who's leading the opposition? Or are they wondering why there isn't a leader, like a person or a group that hasn't risen up, or is it both?
Yeah, it's both. It's both. They're surprised that when they do talk about an opposition in America, they will talk about Bernie, or they'll talk about AOC, but the conversation will kind of end there, because they will wonder why there isn't, in fact, a kind of consistent drumbeat opposition leader against this, that in fact is galvanizing an active opposition. That everybody is what they see are people working within these electoral channels. The only people who are in opposition are running for something, and or they're going to be running for something. If you're Cory Booker, or you're Gavin Newsom, or if you're Pritzker, right? I mean, they're all jockeying for the nomination, and so it defines how they're going to react, because it all has to be within the Democratic Party system. And once you start doing that, your opposition is going to be, by definition, limited. And so when they see that, they don't see, in fact, somebody standing up to represent all opposition, regardless of, they might be a leader of the Democratic Party, but to kind of galvanize everybody in and outside of that party against what's going on. That kind of is what they find to be confusing. I find it to be confusing. But understanding the two-party system and kind of the establishment hold, you can understand it a lot better. And even somebody like AOC, who clearly shows she's got the chops for it, is still operating. We talked about this last time, right? That's still operating within the establishment system, not yet willing to kind of break out to say something, to do something that might get you in trouble with your caucus. And that is something that I think that Europeans find to be very difficult to understand, given the fact that these are, I mean, all of these countries are multi-party systems. That coalition politics is a factor of life in all of these places. I mean, most of these places, and that they have an understanding of a more wide-ranging idea of democracy, rather than something that is structurally and functionally strangled by just having two parties that you have to hone everything into. And therefore, any kind of opposition has to operate within which already circumscribes what you're capable of accomplishing. And that is something that is confusing to people, that they see the principles at stake. They understand the cost of that. They understand, in fact, they know where this train ends in terms of the kind of abuse of authority that is already present in the United States and is only getting worse. They see where that's going. They don't understand that Americans can't see it, and therefore won't do anything about it. People talk about it, but they don't understand how in terms of practicalities, why, yes, Americans say that they recognize it. You have people who are calling it fascism, certainly calling it authoritarianism, and not acting like it. It's bewildering to them. They think that you can call something fascism, and then you think that an election will solve things, as if it's the political parties that are in charge of everything, when they know that that's not the case. They know how this in fact works. They know what the stakes are. They're surprised that there are Americans who identify the stakes, or say they do, and yet don't act don't act consistently with that. They think an election can solve a problem with fascism, and these two things aren't terribly related.
Right now, I think one of the reasons that there isn't a sustained opposition is because there are so many people who are just emotionally and mentally exhausted and broken. It has been 10 years. It has been 10 years of, first Donald Trump's first presidency, and then COVID, the recovery that was long. I mean, the COVID pandemic, especially for people on the front lines, healthcare workers, USPS, Postal Service, people in government, the civil service. We've been going through a long, tough period. What can people who are exhausted, who do feel overwhelmed and are probably more often than not quite tempted to distract themselves or look away, put their head down, what can they learn from our history about how the tired, how the overwhelmed soldier on and actually accomplish something despite the overwhelming force that they feel they're facing?
Vision. The importance of vision, importance of identifying what is on the other side and how you get there, and doing it clearly, realistically, not hope as a strategy. What people are feeling is what I think people were feeling by the time you get to the 1840s and 50s, which is that you see this abuse of authority, you see how it's operating, you see how it's expanding, you see how it's taking more out of your life and the lives of your neighbors and the lives of your friends. You see a country going to war to go ahead and expand its territory in order to do that. You see them taking your son to go do that, and forget about not to mention your taxes. And this weariness that there is nothing you can do about it, because the structure, you're told that the structure is fundamentally sound and that you just need to keep working within the structure. And that's one of the choke points I talk about in the book, is that the culture is there to grind you down through that. Because the vision for what is achievable on the other side of it seems to be outside of your capacity. Until you have somebody that can come along and clearly define what you have to do in order to get there. And I think that it's vision that can energize a resistance, because when you just think that not only there's no end in sight, I mean, resistance can take a long time. But when you can actually see what are the building blocks it takes for you to get to the other side, then you can keep working to it. You can measure progress. You can actually see what the promised land looks like. Mm-hmm. And so when you have people, when we have people like Thaddeus Stevens and others, so when we talk about this, when they say, okay, what we actually need to do to end slavery, to end the abusive authority of the enslaver republic that's taking everything away from you, because they're sucking up all the air and resources in the room and it's all going to the enslavers. That here's what we need to do about it. Here's structurally what we need to do to the Constitution, right? Here are the things. We need to rip out the 3/5 clause. We need to end the Fugitive Slave Act. We need to go ahead and break apart this monopoly that the Southern states had on the federal judiciary, right? We need to change all of this. And we've got these particular things. They're big. They require vision to go ahead and achieve them. They might take a lot to do, but here is what we need to do to get there. And we need to do whatever it takes for that to happen. But you can see what a multiracial democracy might look like on the other side. I'm here, and realistically, this is not pie in the sky. We're going to be realistic about what we can do, and how to get there. That is what gave energy to the resistance to the First Republic in the 1850s. That they could kind of see finally what the other side might look like, and not settle for the people who are telling them trust the system, have faith in the founders. Eventually, the moral arc will bend towards justice. Eventually, all of these things will happen. Just keep trying to vote in the right people, keep trying to morally persuade our leaders to do the right thing, elect the next generation of right leaders so that maybe they will do the right thing. Keep rolling the dice, keep making these bets that somebody will finally do the right thing. People get tired of that. And I think that is what, to the extent that a historian is a sociologist, to see what's going on now, I think that people are there. It's that because we're on this hamster wheel, that there doesn't seem to be any vision of change. And the best we can do is be told by people like John Meacham, continue to trust the system. Just change the people in charge, who in the end might talk left and vote right. You know, I mean, it's that might not do what it is you need it to do, because then the answer is the next election, the next change in people. You keep people away from thinking that the problem is structural and you need to change it. There's nothing that anybody is yet saying that's going to prevent the next Donald Trump. Not one, other than the only thing is elect Gavin Newsom. That's the only thing people say.
Yeah.
The next moral president will fix everything. You see that on social media all the time, that, oh my gosh, the next president will have so much to do in order to fix things when he, and it's always a he, when he gets there. That's an absurd response to this situation. When we know that Trump's really just exploiting the weaknesses in executive authority that are embedded in the Constitution as it is. There's nothing, and being helped by a judiciary that nobody's really talking seriously about changing either. So no one is in fact articulating a clear vision about what that could look like. Saying, okay, well, we need to lift the 435 cap in the House of Representatives and try to sort of make that more democratic and sort of broaden actually democracy in that branch, right? Single terms for presidents, which was floated after Watergate. Some of those revisions to what can be done structurally to the executive. I mean, things like that. You can come up with a Project 2029, for Christ's sake, Chris. You can come up with a plan that, in fact, does what the folks at the Heritage Foundation put into Project 2025. This is a root and branch approach to what American government can and should be. When what you're doing, you're talking about reforms to lower gas prices. I mean, that's what makes people tired. When you hear that our problem is almost existential and the answers are reformist, that makes people tired. And I think that when you can articulate a vision and the possibility of that, then you can really, you can really get something done. But it is the John Meachams of the world that just tell you, have faith, wait. That will make people tired because it's supposed to. Because those are the kind of people who don't want things to change. They want things to stay exactly where they are.
Let's talk for a moment about allies. You write about your enemy's enemy. But you've also, in this conversation, talked about how Europeans are kind of sitting there. There are allies and resources that Americans are not utilizing. So, two-part question. What do you write about when you're referring to our enemy's enemy? And second, how can Americans who are listening to this podcast, not No King's organizers, but the people showing up, how can we access our allies overseas and utilize their resources and what they want to offer us?
When I talk about my enemy's enemy in my book, what I do, I think about it in the way that people on the ground thought about it in terms of resistance movements throughout American history, that in looking at who is useful to the goal that you want to accomplish. And this gets back to the conversation we were having about vision. You've got a clear idea of what you want to achieve, whether it's about removing people from underneath the boot of abusive authority to kind of address the symptoms, or addressing the root cause. You need allies for both of those things. There's not a single resistance movement in history that has done anything on its own, not operating at scale. You need help from outside. You need help from somebody else. One of the important elements of resistance that's operating in that way is being able to identify who is going to help you achieve your goal, not just who your friend is. And I think that is one of the nuanced moments that you have to understand in kind of a ruthless resistance, is to understand that your friends are not necessarily your allies. That the people you're having a beer with at night aren't necessarily the people who are going to help you storm the barricades tomorrow. Is that you have to be very clear about who functionally is going to help you achieve your goal, regardless of why they want to achieve their goal. If you've got the same goals right now, if your stakes are high, then that has to be much lower on your scale than the goal that they want to achieve. It's a great lesson and a very clear lesson from World War II, right? So resistance movements in Western Europe, which I sort of had to study to sort of understand this, were able to understand that exact point, particularly in places like France, where you have Gaullists and you have Democrats, all of you, and you have communists. Normally, you hate each other. But you reach the point where you recognize that that dispute is a luxury. You can fight over that after you've dealt with the bigger problem, which is you got to beat the Nazis. None of the rest matters unless you beat the Nazis. They want to beat the Nazis. You want to beat the Nazis. That's all that matters. You both got to beat the Nazis. But you have to go ahead and have that as a goal. Beat the Nazis, get them out. We fight over the rest later. That happened at different ways in the same dynamic in American resistance history. So it's particularly good for the American Revolution when you understand what loyalists are doing and what the British are doing and what enslaved people are doing, that the choices that enslaved people are making are fairly sophisticated choices about what they want to accomplish and about what they need to accomplish. We have the patriots who are saying very nice things about liberty for all and rights for all. And though, in your heart of hearts, that they don't mean it. None of this is going to change. But the British, who you got no love for either, they set up the system in the first place. Why should you listen to that? But then you understand tactically, they in fact are giving you the resources to help you get out. They are giving you the resources if you believe that your war for independence is a war for your own independence, and you want to win that war. You want to win 50,000, 100,000 of those wars individually, then you fight that war and you find your ally. And if your ally is the British, you're going to use them. You don't care why they're doing it. You don't care that they don't care about your freedom. They just want to undermine the patriots. You don't care. You just have to be clear-eyed to evaluate how much can you rely on it, because it's still a risk. But what's your risk assessment with that? Your risk assessment, you know what's going to happen if you stay with the patriots, that nothing's going to change with that. But you have an idea that you can stress test the claims. This is Dunmore's proclamation, right? You can stress test the claim. Dunmore can say to you that I will only offer freedom to the enslaved men belonging to rebel owners who serve me militarily. That's Dunmore's offer. Well, one of the great things about it is that enslaved Virginians said, I don't care. I will tell you, I want to see whether or not I can make this mean something else. I am a 55-year-old woman. I am a 12-year-old girl in Williamsburg. I'm going to go ahead and see whether I can win my war for independence and make it mean something else. And they made it mean something else. And it's wonderful, the evidence we have for this. And so they were able to make Dunmore's proclamation. This is where historians get it all wrong, right? That historians take that at face value and say, oh, it's only for these people. Well, no, enslaved people made it mean something else, made it mean what they needed it to mean. And so they transformed that into meaning something much bigger. Not men, not just by people who were property of rebels, and not just people who could serve. So it's that you stress test it to understand, okay, where can we push that claim? Will he accept? Will Dunmore accept us? And then will he in fact get us our freedom? And to be able to go ahead and back that up. And that's the lesson going through the whole war, whether they're testing the Phillipsburg Proclamation or they're testing other kinds of things. You have British offers. Enslaved people, they are fighting for their lives. They're not making glib decisions about this. They have children who they want to get free. They're not making casual decisions about this. No parent of somebody, of children anywhere is going to make a casual decision about that. And so you see them making these very clear-eyed choices about who their allies must be, not trusting intentions. They don't care. They can't. They have to be able to put that aside a little bit and just be able to trust the goals that you want to achieve. And so that's the first part of it, is that you've got to kind of put emotion aside. And it's kind of almost all kind of this battle of risk assessment. What do you know versus what you have available to you? Not who's perfect, but what do you have available to you that you can do your best to exploit? And that's kind of a lesson that we see coming up again and again in American resistance history. But the other part of that is that it's the vision you have to have, so you know what you want your allies to do for you. It's not enough for you to say, well, we have allies in Europe, or in the case of like the Underground Railroad, that we have allies in Canada. What do we want to achieve so that we can in fact activate them? So in the case of like the Underground Railroad, that can't operate at scale. You can't get 25, 30, 45,000 people out from under the boot of the enslaver power by moving them from Virginia to New Hampshire. It doesn't work. it falls apart. You're still within the scope of an expanded enslaver power. They pull you back. You have to get out. You have to get outside of that. And so the Underground Railroad isn't able to activate to operate at scale until Canada opens up as a place for them to be safe, to be protected by that authority. So unless you open up that terminus, then you don't have any place to go. It worked the same way in World War II, that you can't get Jewish people out of France, you can't get down pilots out of France unless you can get them to London. You can't get Jewish people out until London says that they'll accept them. Otherwise, all you're doing is you're moving them around in occupied France, and eventually that's not gonna bear out. So that's what I mean, is that you have to have a very clear idea of what you want your allies to do. I mean, is it about even as simple as, like, now, if you want to get people out from under ice, do you want your allies in Canada elsewhere to be able to take them? Do you need another government to say, I'm going to grant a kind of amnesty to folks coming from the United States for this purpose? You need to have something that you want your allies to do in order to activate them. And that gets back to leadership, vision, coordination, leveraging resources. All of those things get you to the point where you can activate this ally base. Now, you know that there are people who are sympathetic, people who are willing to help, willing to operate and help you on a wide range of things, but you got to tell them what it is you need them to do. That can only come from an organized opposition movement within the United States.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think that in my life, as I've learned more about history and resistance, is reframing the lessons that I learned about Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, his famous speech where he talks about the moral arc of the universe, bending towards justice. That I don't think was intended to be pacifying, but I do think that the way that it's been interpreted by students of history is that it is pacifying, is that if we wait long enough, it's going to change, it's going to get better. Is it worth the time of those of us who understand that this is fascism, this is authoritarianism, to try to wake people up and get them involved in the resistance? Is that a good use of our resources, or should we focus almost entirely on the opposition? Is it worth, after 10 years of what we recognize as absurdities and injustice, is it worth us still trying to shake our friends and family into reality, or will reality eventually catch up with them, making our efforts more efficient to use in opposition?
No, you can't wait. You have to think of it as a two-front conflict. There are the people who are Dr. King's white moderates, right? I mean, there are the people standing in the way of you being the most effective opposition you can be. There's not just what you're opposing, but there are the folks standing in the way of what you're opposing, and whether they're passive because they essentially don't know any better, and you need to educate them to know better, or whether they are actively pacifying you. If you're somebody like John Meacham and you're sort of part of that kind of establishment. That is what is enabling, that is what is keeping opposition from operating effectively. Because if it was, and I say this a lot in other spaces, that if it was a fair fight with American resistance against the far right, a direct fair fight against the far right, that's a fight we can win. That's a fight of ideas and language and tactics and strategy. That's a fight straight on that we can win. But there are too many folks standing in the way from keeping you from having the fair fight, because they keep telling other people they don't have to do anything, that the moral arc will bend on its own, to just wait. Well, you need to unlock that resource by continuing to go ahead and go against the people who are enabling, and not just sort of enabling the far right, they're enabling what's going on in terms of authoritarianism to metastasize. Mm-hmm. They're enabling it to grow. Trump is not sitting on the Supreme Court, and that this idea that Trump leaving is going to go ahead and be some sort of answer to that, which is what they want you to think. So you can just kind of wait it out, right? That you're looking, everybody's like, oh my gosh, is today the day? you got to think about J.D. Vance, right? I mean, you got to think about MAGA as a movement and understand and appreciate what that took to build and how it is not just operating even in the executive branch, that they've captured the judiciary, they've captured, they have their own deep state operating here. And so that's why, to understand what's going on, and I go into this a little bit in the book, which is that you have to understand what it is that is keeping opposition from evolving, from emerging and evolving. Because if you don't fight that battle too, then you are forever going to be on a back foot. So you've got to keep pushing against that. And that's one of the interesting things about seeing what's going on in the United States in the 1850s. Because that's the fight that Thoreau's having. Right, that's the fight that Theodore Parker is having. Theodore Parker is the one who originated the line that the moral arc is in the direction of justice. But he didn't mean it the way Dr. King meant it. Dr. King, a great student of Parker and Thoreau, that Parker starts thinking about that in terms of that the moral arc is your power to change things. It's not just this kind of supernatural force that you can just sort of wait for. I think Dr. King has to deploy it in that way, in the same way that Douglas is talking about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, is that this is the language of American political culture that, as an activist in his position, that who's already being labeled as an extremist, you can't cross a line rhetorically. You have to operate within the permitted language, the rhetoric of American political culture. I think that he's kind of using it in that way. I don't want to go too far on that, but I think he's using it in that way. But when you think about Theodore Parker, who originated the phrase, that the way he and others are looking at it, that their enemy, is the enslaver state, but they have to start fighting what they think is the enemy that keeps them from getting at their eventual enemy, which is the moral suasionists, right? The people who are saying, wait, the people who are saying, well, we shouldn't even operate politically because that's getting our hands dirty, is that we just need to continue to remind them of the better angels of our nature, and that a campaign of persuasion will get them to see the errors of their ways if they just read enough Thomas Jefferson. Well, that's a fight. We need to fight that fight in order to make our direct efforts more effective. But because without doing that, then you are just letting that whole front go ahead and suck you dry.
Tell us about your book and the back of it. You've got what looks like a pamphlet within a book about some of the lessons that people should take, the principles of resistance. Is this meant for me to tear out the back of the book and carry it in my pocket?
Yep, absolutely. Rip it out. Rip the whole thing out. Rip it out and start measuring about what's going on around you. The one thing that I thought was really important with it, and as a principle of public history, it's got to be usable. There's some of it that's going to make sense, some of it's not going to make sense, but these are the lessons that come out of lived experience. We're not talking about heroes here. I mean, even though in retrospect they're heroic, but in their moment they're not. In their moment they are doing what they need to do based upon the tools they have in front of them, and that kind of energy and that kind of action is something that we can really learn from. And because this is a part of their authentic experience, we're not saying that these are superheroes. These are people like you. These are people whom you talk to all the time, who are doing the best they can with what they've got to work with. And so if we're able to take lessons from what real people did in extraordinary situations, but what real people did with just what they had at their disposal, then you can, and what I try to do in the book is try to sort of, I'm not being presentist in this stuff. I don't think that gets us anywhere either, and sort of imposing kind of moral values in this stuff. I think that saying slavery is wrong is not being a presentist, but this idea that history can be useful if you're able to make sure that we're talking about relatable moments, relatable times, relatable things, and not putting yourself in a fantasy land in which you're trying to articulate things in a way that don't in fact match. So that's what I think that these lessons are all about, is that here is in fact what real people were doing faced with real challenges in a real moment that I hope I unpack well enough for you to understand what they're facing and how they're making those choices so that you can see how it relates and how it might not. But I want you to rip it out. I want you to mark it up and say, you know what, this is, that here is this guy's a false prophet. Here you go. Is he trying sort of just to use my grievances to accomplish his own goals? Well, that sounds a lot like Nathaniel Bacon to me. Versus somebody, in fact, who is putting together, if you find somebody like this, somebody who's in fact putting together an actual opposition movement, who has worked through the permitted channels and seen them fail, but then makes the decision to operate outside of them, but has a vision about what they want to achieve. But getting back to your previous point, what is kind of interesting about what I have found that about American resistance movements is that they require all sorts of people doing what it is they need to do. And I think that is one thing that when you're looking even at the lessons, when you're looking at all these people who the book is packed with, who are you in that? Are you a Thoreau in which you're thinking and writing? Are you a Thomas Wentworth Higginson who is going out there and in fact doing the organizing and enabling other people who are operating on the ground? Who are you in that? Are you somebody who, even in the very small ways, one of the best chapters, I think, in terms of the lessons, the Ona Judge chapter, which I think one of the points that I hope it makes is that point that you can just be a small part of a resistance in getting somebody like Ona out from under the heel of an abusive authority and then keeping her safe. But it takes all of these individuals in particular roles accomplishing these things. And so whether you're the governor of New Hampshire going ahead and getting Washington's relative drunk so that he can't go after Ona the next day, and then telling Ona she needs to get out because he's coming after her. You need people in all these positions to sort of understand what it is that's in their capacity to do something in that moment. Where does their talent lie? What kind of resistor are they? And so I think that the lessons, where do you fit in identifying how any of these lessons are functioning in your life, can also tell you, well, what kind of resistor am I?
Mm-hmm. What are you going to be doing this summer? You're coming back to the United States. You're doing a book tour. Where can people meet you, get your book, hopefully get a signed copy? And what are you going to be doing at these events?
Well, we're going to be doing a number of different things. We're going to be in from the middle of June through July. We're going to be in DC and Williamsburg and New York City and Boston and LA and a whole bunch of parts in between. We're going to be doing traditional book talks and bookstore events. But one of the things that we're going to be doing a lot of, and I certainly hope you're going to be a part of them, is that I want to do plenty of resistance discussions in which you, me, others are in fact engaging people informally where they are. Whether we're doing that whether we're doing that at a tavern, whether we're doing that on Lafayette Square, across from the White House, whether we're doing that. Wherever we can do that, I want to be able to have conversations with people about what resistance means to them and about how resistance history and resistance in other contexts can inform what they're doing right now. I am not interested in talking about the book. People can read the book. I'm happy to answer questions about the book. What I want to do is spend the summer talking about resistance. We can talk about how history informs it, but I am mostly interested in talking about where it is living right now and how we can kind of do the work to connect people who are having that same discussion. And we can break it down systematically. We can break it down functionally. We can have the kind of conversation that we're having right now. What are we doing practically? And how is that informed by the lived experience who have lived through these moments in the past or similar moments in the past? That's what I hope that we can do in informal ways all over the place this summer.
So, as you know, because you were my first guest, I end every episode by asking my guest, what can the people listening to this episode do to go on offense? I feel like we've talked about a lot throughout this episode, but if you could distill it down to one thing, one final thought, what do you want to leave our listeners with?
This is an old Army thing. Find the signal in the noise right now. Right now, around the 250th especially, right now in June and July, there is so much noise about what America is, what America's supposed to be, and the essential inherent goodness of what America is supposed to mean. But that's a lot of noise. You got to find the signal in that about what you think is actually going on and how power is situated within the America that created. What are people actually saying when they're telling you what a great guy George Washington was? What are they actually saying when they're doing that? Because it's not about George Washington. It's about what's going on right now and what they want you to think America is right now. It's doing a lot of work. And so as I keep telling my students, you've got to understand the work that's being done by people who are talking to you about this stuff. Find the signal in that noise.
Tad Stoermer, author of A Resistance History of the United States, which is out now anywhere that you can get your books. Check out your local indie bookstore. And as Tad said, rip it up, mark it up. I already started doing that and just got my copy in the mail. So, Tad, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate you coming back.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
One of the things that I hope stays with you from this conversation is Tad's argument that resistance movements aren't built by heroes. They're built by ordinary people who decide that they're going to do something. Not everyone is going to run for office. Not everyone is going to organize a protest. Not everyone is going to write a book. But every successful resistance movement in American history was built by people who figured out what role they could play and then got to work. Because waiting only allows the authoritarians to gain more power, and nobody is coming to save us. We have to do it ourselves. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Valor Media Network on YouTube and to On Offense with Chris Goldsmith anywhere you get your podcasts. Leave a rating or review, leave comments, like it, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. That'll help us grow this show. On Offense is produced by Gina Kim and edited by the Lombardos for Valor Media Network. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.